Morning, folks. I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters. What I want to do today is I want to start a series of basic videos that will walk through tools and equipment, basic to survival, basic to bushcraft, and basic to just every outdoor activity like camping. We're going to start with knives because I think knives are probably one of the first things that people look at when they decide they're going to buy outdoor gear. And particularly in this video, we're going to talk about fixed blade knives or belt knives. In other words, knives that do not fold. They're one solid piece construction, okay? And we're going to talk about full tang knives, which means that that knife is one solid piece of steel with the scales bolted to both sides. There's no rat tail tang or partial tang inside. That knife is a knife that we can rely on to do everything we need to do that would be something beyond what our pocket knife may be capable of. So if we need to basically baton some kindling down for firewood, or we need to limb something real quick around camp so that we don't have a stick out poking us in the eye while walking around camp. So we're talking about a utilitarian style knife that we can abuse if we need to and not worry about breakage. So a full tang knife is always going to be your best bet for that. That's not to say that a lot of partial tang and rat tail tang knives are not very strong, because they are. But if you're going to put them through abuse, whether it's a normal activity or an emergency, you want to make sure that that knife's going to be robust, and a full tang knife is the most robust knife you can get as far as a belt knife goes. So, I guess the first thing we should cover in this is the use intent of that knife, because that really helps you select the belt knife that you prefer. If you're planning to do bushcraft, and I use the word bushcraft with the word craft emphasized, you're planning to craft items off the landscape, you're going to want a smaller blade and you're going to want a narrower blade. Something that you can choke up a little bit on, do fine carving tasks with, basically use the point of that knife or the very end of that knife for very, very fine carving stuff, and still not have a whole lot of it sticking out to where you're trying to manipulate the point from here or choke halfway up on the knife and you still got the point sticking up here. You want a nice small knife for that. And I would say probably as far as the PKS knives go, and we'll talk mainly about those today, this Scorpion Edition knife is what I would call a good bushcraft knife. So the knife is a little bit longer than the width of my hand, so it's a little over 4 inches. I can choke all the way up on this knife and still have my hand wrapped around the handle with my finger so that I can manipulate the tip of this knife if I need to and not be up on the blade with my fingers. I can put my thumb on the back of the knife for leverage and cover over half of the blade with my thumb for leverage on cuts, for scissor cuts and things like that if I want to. And at the same time, it's a full tang knife, so it's robust enough. If I need to break down some killing with it or something like that at camp, I'm not afraid to do that. And it's a very good blade geometry in general, which we'll talk about in a minute, for skinning animals and processing food and game, all right? So something like that is what I'm talking about with use intent. What do I intend to use that knife for? Now, if I want a knife that's more of a camp chore style knife, then I'm going to be looking at a knife that possibly is a little bit thicker, possibly a little bit wider, and possibly even a little bit longer. But it doesn't necessarily have to be thicker. So we could be talking about something like this Camp and Trail, which is only 3/16 thick instead of 1/8 inch thick. And it could be used for any kind of a camp task, as well as food processing and butchering game and things like that. Very much like the old butcher knives of the days gone by, like Old Hickory and things like that. Green River, all those type butcher knives had the same type butcher design. We'll talk more about that here in a minute as well. Now, if our design intent is to give that knife heavy abuse, or if it's possibly going to be some kind of a chopping implement that we need, then we need a little bit longer blade than that. But we don't need to get ridiculous with it either. So something like this HD, Scorpion HD, which has got a 5-inch blade now, instead of a blade just over 4 inches. It's got a 3/16 blade on it instead of 1/8 inch. This is a heavy duty blade. All right, this is something you could pry with and do all kinds of things with it and never have to worry about it. And it falls more into that survival knife kind of mentality where it's a heavy pry bar type knife. And that blade could be up to 6 inches long, but I wouldn't go much longer than that, I don't think. And it could be as wide as up to 1.5 inches or something like the Survival Series knives from PKS, like the PKS Survival. So really what you want to think about is what's my intent with that knife. If I'm going to do chopping, splitting, hacking, things like that, then a wider blade doesn't matter to me. A thicker blade doesn't matter to me. If I want a little bit more finesse with that knife around camp, then I may want something that's a little bit longer, but still not so thick. So I've got a little bit more finesse with that knife, and it's not so unwieldy for things like processing food or processing game. And then if I want to craft with that knife, then I want a narrower blade and a shorter blade so that I can get all of the hand positions on that blade that I need to be able to do fine crafting work if I don't want to use my pocket knife for that, okay? So use intent is a big part of this. Steel composition. There are hundreds of different types of steels out there that knives are made out of. What I would tell you in the beginning is get a simple knife steel, something that's easy to sharpen and easy to maintain, because some of the more complicated steels and stainless steels are harder to sharpen. While they'll stay sharper longer once the job is done, they're harder to maintain over time in the field, and they're harder to maintain at home as well, because you need more specialized equipment sometimes as far as different grits of stones and things like that to get the job done well, whereas simple steels are exactly that, pretty simple, all right? I'm talking about 1095, C100 if you're talking about more knives, things like that that are simple carbon steels, okay? Blade geometry. Blade geometry has to do with the width and the length, but it also has to do with the overall shape of the knife. And so when you talk about geometry, we'll talk about kind of an odder geometry right now. The typical Nesmuk style knife is a butcher-esque geometry, but it's also kind of a spear point in some aspects. And then it also has a nice belly on the blade as well, which makes it good for slicing. So the Nesmuk style design is a geometry that you might choose depending on what you want to do with that knife. If I'm looking for an all-around camp butchering, maybe I got a process kindling kind of stuff, maybe the Nesmuk is my choice because it does have a 5-inch blade, it's 1/8 of an inch thick, and it's got a nice wide blade at the top, but it's fairly narrow at the bottom, so that I can do some narrower work with it if I need to at the bottom, but I've still got that heavy, wide butchering style tip that will ride up on bone and things like that when I am dressing game. Another geometry that you might see is like a drop point, like this, what's called a drop point. This is more of a butchering style knife as well. This drop point is because, again, you know, it has a tendency to ride up on bone and things like that. This one's only about 4.5 inches. It's 1/8 inch thick. This is a pretty good geometry right here for just a normal hunting, skinning knife. If I'm carrying a knife and my intent is to take that knife out hunting, and I'm going to be processing medium to large game with it, this is a very good choice for that style knife. Now, when we talk about blade geometry for things like bushcrafting, again, I go back to things like this. This is a normal Scorpion, different handle design. We'll talk about ergonomics in a minute. But the blade geometry is exactly the same as the Outfitters edition. So you have, again, you have that just over 4-inch blade that you can choke up on really well. And the geometry of this knife lends itself well to be able to do things like fine carving tasks and whittling tasks. And it also does well around camp for processing food and things like that as well. And it's a lighter weight knife because it's not as big. The grind of your knife, okay, and there are several different types of grinds. So we'll talk about that real quick. You have what's called a V grind or Scandinavian grind knife. You have what's called a convex grind knife, which is more like this with a micro bevel here. Those are the two that you're going to see most often. Now, sometimes you're going to see a knife that has a V grind with a micro bevel on it, okay? And a lot of the Mora knives have that micro bevel, like the Mora Garberg and things like that. That micro bevel is to add stability to the blade because you reduce the material thickness pretty dramatically here, depending on the degree of that grind. And most of these are about a 22 to 23 degree grind when you're talking about V grinds or what people call Scandinavian grinds. However, a true Scandinavian grind, as described by Mora Knives, is really that V grind with a secondary grind at the bottom of about 35 degrees, if I remember right. Again, to add stability to this blade. Now, if you look at something like a carving knife made by Mora, it's a true Scandi to zero, as are all of the knives from PKS. And the true Scandi to zero, especially on a really fine blade or a small, thin blade, what happens with that is they can tend to roll if you're not careful, depending on the steepness of the grind. And again, the width of the blade and how high that grind goes up on the blade, how much material reduction there is. So most of the Mora carving knives were created for carving softer wood. So if you buy like a Mora 106 or a Mora 105 or something like that, or a Mora basic, and you're talking about carving things like oak, hickory, elm, you're probably going to roll that Scandinavian grind because it was never made for that. It was made for things like birch, pine, softer woods that you're going to carve. That's what that knife is made for. That zero grind is a razor sharp edge. However, it's not real stable unless the blade's a little wider and it's a little bit more of an angle this direction to give it some thickness here in the blade so that it doesn't roll as easy, okay? So those are just a couple things real quick. And the most common you're gonna see is like V grinds and convex grinds. Convex grinds, the difference in these two really is this is more of an abuse grind, okay? If I'm gonna abuse this knife and I want it to not worry about it, then a convex grind may be good for you. The problem I see with convex grinds on knives the majority of the time is they're more difficult, again, to maintain or sharpen in the field than something that has one straight edge that you can actually lay that edge down and pick it up on something just to that grind and register the bevel. In other words, contact the bevel itself with the stone and be able to pull that or push that, depending on how you're sharpening it, to remove material or to hone the knife. It's much more difficult to do that on a knife that you have to roll as you're doing things or manipulate because the grind is a curve instead of just a flat surface. So my suggestion, somebody was asking, would be a Scandinavian grind on a knife that gives you the angle of that grind that adds strength to the blade itself, the blade edge itself, but is still a very, very sharp knife and easy to maintain in the field, all right? So we talked about grinds. Ergonomics is really the last thing you need to think about, or maybe it's the first thing you need to think about when you're selecting a knife. And sometimes that takes having a knife in your hand to be able to use it for a while to understand how it feels to you. And that's kind of the reason that we came out with two different versions of the Scorpion, which is my favorite knife, is the Scorpion Geometry, the Scorpion Profile are my favorite knives. However, we've got two different ones because we have one of them that has a contoured handle and it fits my hand almost perfectly. And that's usually what happens. The designer of a knife makes a knife to fit his hand. But I have some pretty big hands. So when I put my hand on this blade, I want my index finger to rest here, and I want to be able to put the other three fingers inside this second swell, just like this. And then it's comfortable ergonomically for me, and it's stable in my hand. Now, we also make an outfitter's edition of that knife, which just has more of a barrel handle on it. So it's going to be comfortable for anybody who grabs it pretty much, however big or small your hands are. When you grab that thing, you're going to get the same feel for the most part. It's also very conducive to be able to use that knife in a reverse grip that way because it's a broom handle design. So it feels generally the same way, either direction it's facing in your hand. So that covers ergonomics, how that knife feels in your hand, how well it's going to feel in your hand after you've used it for quite a while, not just as soon as you pick it up. The grind of the knife, the blade geometry of knives, steel composition of knives, again, stay simple with that, and the use intent. Understanding your use intent is probably one of the most important things other than ergonomics that you can think about when you're buying your first knife. When you're buying your first knife, understand what am I going to use this thing for and make an intelligent decision based on that.